Today, you will hear the story of a self-proclaimed loudmouth who lost her voice and therefore her power during birth. This was the start of losing her voice throughout the postpartum period in a system where little support was offered. This led to severe postpartum psychosis. You will also hear the story of a person who took back that power for her second birth and learned to create her own systems of support so that she could safely care for her second baby and still have her own needs met. This story does touch on Joyce's intrusive thoughts of suicide. If this is a topic that you should avoid for your own well-being, come back to this one when you're ready to learn all that Joyce has to offer from the wisdom she's gained from thinking deeply about this topic for 27 years. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. Many of my clients are surprised by their own self-doubt and anxiety over every baby feeding decision. And in the years that I've been connecting with people during pregnancy and breastfeeding, I've seen time and time again that those anxieties are reduced through hearing from others about their experiences without judgment or fear. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh. I invite you to sit back and listen in to reduce your breastfeeding anxiety through explorations of real-life breastfeeding. Hi, Joyce. Welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad you prioritized this in your busy schedule. So before we get into your breastfeeding experiences, I would love for you to introduce yourself and your family, however much you feel comfortable telling on a public platform.
Sure. So I'm Joyce Kimball. I live in central Massachusetts. I have, oh my gosh, a now 27-year-old son and a almost 23-year-old daughter. It's amazing. I know. And back when I had kids, I was not involved in birth or pregnancy. I was the director of human resources for an energy company, and I hired and fired people, and I wrote employee handbooks. So I knew nothing about nothing.
Which is funny because anybody who knows you now, you're like the birth queen. Right?
I know. I'm married to a great guy, Mike. We've been together for over 30 years, which is pretty cool. Yeah, right. Everybody knows me now because about a year after I had my second, I literally did a 360 and I left. I knew when I got pregnant with Julia that I was not going to go back to my corporate job. So I had her in September. I stayed home with her for a year, and then I literally jumped into the home birth midwifery, birth doula, childbirth ed classes, and I just jumped in. And so I've been doing that work for 22 years. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's how everybody knows me.
Yeah. So you're like famous in this area, super active in the Massachusetts birth world, both on an advocacy level and as a practitioner.
Right. But I think a lot of people hire me for birth services. It's funny because my business name is Joyce Kimball Birth Services. And I think a lot of people hire me for my birth services because I want to say like a loudmouth. And I do say how challenging it was for me to have children and to breastfeed and to work and to change my career. So I think I'm a very straight shooter. And I think maybe that's why people know me is because I'm such a straight shooter.
Yeah. Well, I haven't told much of my story on the podcast, bits and pieces, but you were my home birth midwife for my second child. And the reason we hired you was because you were a straight shooter, but also I wish I could remember you said you were not a home birth.
I'm not a cowboy.
Yes, you were not a home birth cowboy. That we were not going to home birth at all costs.
Right.
And if we needed to make a different choice, we would do that at any point throughout the pregnancy or the labor and delivery. And we almost had to with mine. We came really close at the very end. And so that brought a sense of comfort to both me and to my husband that as a home birth midwife, you felt passionately about it. You advocate for it, but you had nothing to prove if there was something else that needed to happen. And that made us feel really safe.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
So you are a practitioner, but you're here to talk about your stories as a mother,
Yeah.
as a mother and as a human being. And I know you've been on other podcasts and told this story before, but we're going to focus not really on the birth stories, but on the breastfeeding part. And from the hints that you have dropped for me, it was a mixed bag. It was difficult for you. So before we get into it, I know you said you were not in the birth world at all, but I would love to know what your exposure was to breastfeeding.
Right. And the answer is none. I was a 28-year-old first-time pregnant woman. I worked in corporate America. I had no friends that had kids. I was the first of my friends and family to have children. My mother had 4 cesareans, and I have a sense that she breastfed, but we didn't talk about birth. We didn't talk about breastfeeding. There literally was nobody around me that was either having babies or breastfeeding babies or feeding babies. I don't even think I held babies. I might have babysat some, 5 and 7-year-old, kids when I was in high school a few times.
Yeah.
But it was just not even. And then I knew enough things. What did I know? I knew enough to write a birth preferences list. I knew that I wanted to hire midwives. And at that time, UMass had midwives. And I knew I wasn't super well connected to my pregnancy. So I was going to some counseling in pregnancy. And then my little squirt decided to arrive at 35 weeks. My water breaks and at 35 and 0. And I go to the hospital because that's what you do. And back then, they don't induce me. They just say, okay, your water's broken. You have some IV antibiotics in case your water broke because of an infection. And your baby will probably come in a week. And they kind of like stuck me in a room. So he had other plans. So he arrives 18 hours later, fast and furious. Like, I don't know why. Whenever my labor starts. I did have the fluids from the antibiotics and the antibiotics. I felt like I had this kind of shiny, dark blue pajama set. And I feel like I was like a blueberry because I was so swollen.
Yeah.
From the antibiotics.
Yeah.
I didn't get Pitocin. I didn't have time to get Pitocin, and they didn't do afterbirth Pitocin at that time. But I did have a wicked 3rd-degree episiotomy. So he's born early, small, 6 pounds, 13 ounces.
Okay. Small side, but not tiny. Yeah.
Right. And like a pumpkin. Black hair. And I think nowadays they would have had me put him under the lights. But this is it feels like a long time ago.
Yeah.
So 2 days later, they send me home. I nurse him. I go, okay. I nurse him. I remember having milk. I remember not ever having cracks, blisters, or bleeding. But it always felt like shark teeth every time he latched. I can remember the toe curling and the tears and the what I call the 15-second latch on tingle, which is more like 15-second shark teeth. Right. And I just thought that was normal. My pediatrician was so chill that I showed up at the pediatrician at 2 weeks and they were like, oh, he's gaining. And I kind of went home.
Wow.
And yeah.
Okay. Let me stop you for a second because I want to back up a little bit. I know that we are going into the treasure trove of your memory. So it was a lot. It was 27 years ago.
Yeah.
And 27 years ago, let's see, I was a teenager. So I'm imagining what it would be like if you're asking me to remember details of an event. Right. But I do think that people sometimes tend to remember more details of a birth event because it is one of those formative events of a person's life. So he's delivered vaginally in the hospital, IV fluids and antibiotics. Any other pain medication?
No.
Okay. And then did they do immediate skin to skin?
No.
Okay.
I didn't have him on me for 50 minutes. It was terrible.
Okay.
I remember the loss feeling. Yes. I remember him crying and crying and crying in the warmer. and not getting him on me for close to an hour. It was terrible.
So they swept him away.
Yes.
Cleaned him.
Yes.
Wrapped him up.
Sutured me and didn't put him back on me until they were finished suturing me.
And this was just the common practice.
It was just
of the
a
time.
common practice.
Yeah. And you said you felt that loss. You were already feeling the loss of I want my baby.
Yes.
Now, you hired and fired people at that time. So you already had a voice, but it's different when you're there with your legs spread open and
100%.
somebody's showing you up. So did you just keep that loss in your brain? Did you try to say something to somebody? Were you not even aware of that feeling of like, I want my baby? Or did you just think this is what you do?
I felt like I had been in a car accident. My births are so fast and so overwhelming that I absolutely felt the loss, but I felt like I hadn't even caught my breath yet. Like I couldn't speak. And the funny thing is, the same thing happened to me in my second birth, which was at home, but just as fast. I just have no voice. I have no voice.
Yeah. You just
I'm just
run over by a Mack truck.
Yes. I'm just like, but with the second, she came out and they laid her on me and just beautiful sensation of skin to skin. But I do remember the absolute feeling of loss and the ache in my heart, hearing him cry on the warmer. And I remember practicing for my second birth in the car with my son, give me my baby. And we would repeat it like a mantra.
Oh my goodness. That makes me want to cry, Joyce.
I know. We practiced. Give me my baby. Give me my baby. Because I couldn't speak. And I thought if I practiced it enough, if I had to go to the hospital to have this baby, I could say, give me my baby, because I just couldn't speak the first time. Yeah. And I actually couldn't speak the second time.
When I first listened to this weeks after the initial recording, I was blown away by the sound of loss in Joyce's voice to this day, after 27 years. If you have experienced a sense of loss over anything that happened during your birth or while breastfeeding your babies, know that these strong feelings are not inconsequential. They impact you deeply because what happened to you was no small thing. And Joyce demonstrates this to us through the shake in her voice 27 years after this experience, even as she has helped so many people find their voice in birth and the postpartum period.
Right. And that's why it's so important to change policy.
Yes.
Because we can't just expect people to be able to say, I want skin to skin, and immediately, and no, don't clean off my baby, and no, don't weigh my baby, and no, don't measure my baby. Policy has to change because not everyone has the voice in the moment.
And you know how mouthy I am and what an advocate I am. And I go to the state house. I'm incredibly articulate for who I am and what I want and what I need. But in those moments, I could not speak.
Yeah.
I could not speak.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm so sorry that you experienced that loss. What a hard thing. And to be hearing your baby. And I'm so glad that the second experience you had the people there who knew to put the baby on you. And even though you had the feeling of being hit by a Mack truck again at that home birth, the way you described the feeling of that skin to skin contact washing over you, it almost sounds like it helped to bring about some healing to the birthing process that was still a little bit traumatic. Would you say it was still traumatic for you?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll be honest. I could not articulate in labor to touch me here or don't touch me here. So I was angry at myself for my second birth for 9 years for my inability to speak. I held so much. I mean, I had a 3-hour unmedicated vaginal home birth with my baby skin to skin. And I was still angry with myself because I couldn't say to her, stop touching my perineum, that hurts. And she was putting oil on my perineum because she thought that that was the right thing to do. I don't think that OBs or midwives feel like they're harming, but I'm absolutely an advocate for birth preferences and postpartum preferences because I personally could not speak. Even as mouthy as I am, I couldn't speak.
Yeah. So I love hearing the comparison between that first experience and that second experience. And also I love hearing that, it's not that home birth is going to be the magic pill that's just going to cure it all. Now,
it helps a lot,
especially if you have providers who you feel really safe with and who are going to listen to you and who are going to, be your full partner in making decisions. It helps a lot.
Yeah.
And I think, I always, as someone who's like been slowly entering the profession of birth work for the last 7 years, I feel like I always really connect with people who came to birth work through struggle themselves. Mm-hmm. And not the people who are like, it's amazing, it's magical, it's glorious, because it's not that way for everyone.
Right.
And it's great if it can be that way, but it does not have to be a euphoric or orgasmic experience, neither birth nor breastfeeding.
No.
For it to be the thing you still want to do.
Right. 100%. It can be both and. Yeah. Yep. I would be like, I hate this and I'm doing this.
Right. I've done that with a lot of things in my life.
Yep.
Okay.
I do remember being in the hospital with my first, and that was at the time that they were like, let's bring your baby into the nursery for the night so you can sleep. And I can remember getting out of bed maybe at like 4 a.m. and going over to the nursery. And I was like, I want my baby. And they were like, oh, you can't come in here with bare feet. You have to go back to your room and put on socks, because there could be, it's so funny that I remember these little things. There could be some broken glass on the floor. So you have to go back to your room, put on socks, and then come back and get your baby.
Why is there broken glass on the floor of a nursery? That's my first question.
But I can remember wanting my baby.
Yeah.
And actively going to the nursery. Why I didn't push the button, maybe I did, but I remember her telling me, oh, you have to go back to your room, put socks on, then come back to the nursery to get your baby, to bring your baby back to your room.
So weird.
It was so weird.
So was there anyone who was helping you in the hospital to evaluate your latch or to learn different positioning to maybe make it more comfortable? Was there anyone who was checking with you to see how you were feeling about breastfeeding? Nobody. That just was not.
No.
No nurses. No lactation staff.
No. Nope.
So it was just meant for you to do it. And was the expectation that you would breastfeed, or the expectation was that you would formula feed and you were an outlier?
I think I was asked, and I think because I had the midwifery practice, the expectation that was that I was going to breastfeed.
Uh-huh.
And that is what I did put in my birth preferences list, that I did want to breastfeed.
Okay. But there was nobody who was providing any sort of support, either mental health wise or actual physically helping you figure out breastfeeding.
Not at all.
Okay. So you go home 2 or 3 days later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't see the pediatrician until week 2, which I don't understand why that is, but it is what it is.
Yeah. And a lot can happen in 2 weeks.
And they were just like, okay, go home, nurse your baby.
Yeah. So you were said with your first, you were experiencing that. I know exactly the feeling you're talking about, the shark on the nipple feeling. Mm-hmm. I actually just saw this funny Instagram video where a lactation consultant had an actual toy shark on a breast. And they were like, nope, shouldn't be this, So you were feeling that shark on a nipple feeling. Did that last for the duration of your breastfeeding? Or
it lasted about 3 weeks.
3 weeks, which is a long ass time.
It's a long ass time. And he nursed all the time. Mm-hmm. He was little.
Mm-hmm. And 35 weeks. He was a preemie.
And he was 35 weeks.
Which is even funnier that your first appointment wasn't for 2 weeks later.
I know.
I wish my listeners could actually see the looks on our faces.
I know. There was no additional follow-up. I nursed. It hurt. He cried it felt like all the time. I stayed home for 12 weeks. It was such a shock to the system. I was not expecting him to come. So I was going through literally the incineration of my previous life. And it just so happened that enough milk pours down his throat. He's, we're both basically high needs, right? He cries all the time. I cry all the time. My bottom hurts a lot. I thought that I was going to wear a white nightgown and soft light, and you would sit in a rocking chair and you would nurse your baby and your baby would just latch, and then you would lay your baby down on a safe sleeping surface and walk away and go to sleep. I thought I was doing something wrong because that was not working. I never learned how to nurse in any other position other than sitting in that damn chair. I wanted to burn in that damn chair. No football hold, no lay down nursing. You're supposed to sit in the chair and do cross cradle, and your baby's going to nurse. He happened to be a very efficient nurser, and I happened to have a good supply of milk. But it was not easy and it was not comfortable. And I, again, was going through the incineration of my previous life in corporate America.
Yeah. And so did your pediatrician, was there ever, did the Edinburgh scale exist, or was there any check-ins to your mental health at the time?
By 6 weeks, I saw my midwives, it was a hospital-based practice of midwives. And at 6 weeks, they had asked for a survey. And at that point in time, after sitting for 6 weeks, I had sword in the butt hemorrhoids, and I was sobbing. And I remember writing the survey I need help. This hurts so much. I'm isolated. I'm alone. I can remember writing all of this stuff. I was completely overwhelmed. I was sleep deprived. And there was no response to that. I all this time, writing all this stuff out,
finally, I'll get somebody who's going to help me.
So I went back to work at 12 weeks. I had not slept. And my husband stayed home for 6 weeks, unpaid, which was a really big deal back then. They took his sales bonus and his sales trip away because he did that. Anyway, I couldn't wait to get away from my kid, and I pumped. And I would come home at lunch and nurse him. And I would nurse him before I would go to work. And then I would go to work and I would pump, and I would walk into either home or the daycare center and nurse him again, and basically nurse him from the moment I saw him at 5 p.m. till 5 a.m. He sitting in the stupid chair because I didn't know you could lay down and nurse. So by about 2 months post birth, I was hallucinating. And I was seeing disembodied hands come out of the air. And I would wake up asleep thinking my baby was on the floor and he was in my arms, that kind of thing. Oh, man. Because I wasn't sleeping.
Yeah. And at that time, were there any peer support group? Was La Leche League around?
So this is what saved me from killing myself. At 3 months post-birth, I found a La Leche League group, and it literally saved my life. Not because the breastfeeding or sleeping got better, but because I could say hard things without being judged.
Great. Yeah.
I could have compassion. People gave me compassion. And some of those women are my best friends, and we do Mom's Weekend Away now. It created a community for me.
Yeah.
Because the breastfeeding event, the pain went away, and I had a lot of milk, but I had a high needs, high colicky, never sleep kiddo. And at work, in my corporate America world, people were like, you got to stop nursing that kid, or you need to not coddle him, or you need to sleep train, or whatever. But at La Leche League, they accepted him and I would just sob at breastfeeding at La Leche League meetings, and they would be like, yeah, And they would validate me. We'd go to like La Leche League group meetings and we'd put all the kids on the couch and mine would be the one that's screaming his head off.
Right.
And they'd be like, oh yeah.
Right.
And the rest of them were all calm and everyone could see like, yep, that's the one that needs to be held all the time.
Right. And did he remain that way, Joyce?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a communicator. He cries every week now, and he's 27. Right. And he'll tell you that. I feel deeply and I cry.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wish, because my oldest is the same way. And he's not 27, he's 9. But I wish that I had put a lot less energy into trying to change his little baby person when I was a new mom.
Yeah.
And put a lot more energy into just connecting and trying to understand him.
Yes. Yes. Well, like we want our kids to communicate their feelings. And literally that's what he was doing. Mm-hmm. And I heard from society, I'll never forget in the work world, like stop nursing him, do the bottle. Honestly, the breastfeeding worked. Like it was like the best thing we had going. Right. You're right. I was like, so focused on having him be different than he was. Right. And he just is who he is. And he's amazing. I wish I could have taken naps with him during the day. I wish I had 6 months off from work and I could just take naps when he was taking naps.
Right.
Instead, I was nursing him all night, which felt right. Mm-hmm. But of course, sitting in the chair. And by then I was hallucinating. I thought it was my marriage. I was blaming my husband. Mm-hmm. We went to marriage counseling within the first year. I went to one doctor. They gave me sleeping pills. I didn't take them because I wasn't going to take sleeping pills for my breast. Like it was the system that wasn't working. It wasn't that I needed sleeping pills. I didn't take them.
Right.
And he had 9 ear infections in his first year.
Brutal.
And back then, you medicated those things. So he's had Augmentin and amoxicillin and all the sulfa drugs. And just, he was, So we're going through around 9 months. I still breastfeeding, exclusively breastfeeding. And I'm like, okay, let's try sleep training, right? Mm-hmm. I think we tried it for one night. And it was like, I couldn't do it. There were nights I became suicidal. I wanted to kill myself and him to stop the crying. I thought if I just drive this car into the side of this railroad, like we could just all be out of misery. And I knew I wouldn't do it, but I was starting to have really bad intrusive thoughts. I didn't have that language back then. I knew I didn't tell anybody. Mm-hmm. I had never been to therapy. I didn't know the word intrusive thoughts, but I knew something was wrong. And I think that's why we went to marriage counseling and I went to the doctor and said, I can't sleep because my baby's crying. And I think that's why I wrote the survey to the midwives, but I didn't know the word intrusive thoughts, but I knew that the hallucinations and the intrusive thoughts, something was wrong.
Right.
I knew something was wrong.
Right.
But I couldn't access the resources. Uh-huh. I was really
and it's really scary, especially when you don't trust your providers, to know, can I go to this provider and tell them I'm having thoughts that are telling me to harm myself and my baby, because you don't know what the repercussions of that are going to be.
Right.
And so to try to get the help you need without uttering those words, like to try to signal to people, I seriously need help, without saying, this is what is happening.
I remember one time calling Postpartum Support International and I didn't get a call back.
What?
This is years and years and years.
It's a way more robust system now.
Of course.
You can text. You can even reach out on Instagram.
I think that I was with a group of people in La Leche League who had much more challenging marriages and partnerships than I did. So we were validating each other's experiences, and no one ever thought to say, like, it wasn't as common as it is now to go to therapy, to deal with postpartum. I had postpartum psychosis, and nobody used that word until my kids were 15 years old. Like, nobody said those words. Again, and nobody said the word intrusive thoughts. I didn't have that lingo back then.
Right. Yeah. I know it was a long time ago, but I still want to say I'm sorry.
Thank you. It was
rough. Yeah. So hard to experience that and to know that it's really serious, but to not have a place to put it.
Do you love to read about pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding? Are you looking for books to help you become a more confident parent? Or perhaps books to help you understand what went wrong with your breastfeeding journey or to do better next time with breastfeeding? Or do your kids have questions about breastfeeding or pregnancy, but you don't really know how to answer them? Would you prefer to have a curated list on these topics? Go to the link in the show notes to my new affiliated bookshop. Every purchase you make benefits the Milk Making Minutes. But better than that, these books are vetted. I've read them all, and I feel very confident recommending them to you. I'll be adding to them continuously, so go to that link when you want to purchase a book. It will help the show, and you can feel confident it will be a purchase you will enjoy. I started the Milk Making Minutes because I'm passionate about supporting breastfeeding people. But more importantly, I knew that hearing real people tell real stories would benefit both the storytellers and the listeners. I had this idea for 3 years before I launched. I asked so many people how I should begin, and Anchor came up repeatedly as the easiest way to launch a podcast. And I have not been disappointed. If you are passionate about a topic and have wanted to start a podcast, you can use Anchor to record and distribute your podcast. It's easy to use. You can use the editing tools right from the platform. You can distribute your podcast episodes seamlessly to listening platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts right from Anchor. And the best part is, it's free. And the tech support has been great too. Go to anchor.fm or download the app right to your phone to get started on your great podcast idea. After this very heartbreaking discussion about postpartum psychosis, I asked Joyce to tell me how breastfeeding with her son wrapped up. This is what she had to say.
I continued to nurse him, and he ate people food, but it felt like 15 months. He could walk, and he could understand me. We nursed all the time. But there were more happy times than there were crying times.
Yeah.
15 months was like a turning point for me. And I nursed him till he was 2.5. I did not leave him alone at night with anybody else until he was 2.5 years old.
Yeah.
We just needed to honestly heal from birth and the shock of him coming into the universe.
Yeah.
And then I was starting to adjust my work schedule. Like, he's now going to sleep at 7. I'm going to leave work at 3. Or he's now going to sleep at 10 p.m. I'm going to come in late. You know what I mean? Like, I started to find my voice and find what worked best so that I could prioritize him.
I then asked Joyce to tell me how she realized that home birth was an option for her second baby. And her story is a little bit funny, but not very surprising. Many of us come to alternative forms of medical care through a personal experience, and Joyce's introduction to home birth midwifery was no exception.
So I vowed never to have another baby.
Okay.
And I got invited to a friend's home birth to watch her kids, because now Dave's, 3.5 years old, 3.5. And so I can attend births of friends because my kid's not nursing anymore and is old enough. And the first birth I ever went to in 1998 was a VBAC home birth. And I was like, this is freaking amazing. And I came home and said, let's have another baby. And I was pregnant in 2 months.
Oh my gosh. That's amazing. So now you're like pregnant, and you've already told us you had a fast and furious second birth where you lost your voice again, and you had some trauma. You were touched in ways you didn't like, and you weren't able to say that. But you did get that experience of like baby coming right away.
Yes. And I set it up different, knowing what postpartum was going to be like.
Okay. Oh, let's hear about that. Because
I created this little chart called the After Julia Task List because I knew I couldn't ask for help. So I had this little chart that's like, take out trash, buy me a gallon of milk, take Dave to and from preschool. And when people would ask, what can they do to help? I'd say, go to the chart and check off anything on the chart because I couldn't, even me, Miss like ballsy advocate, I could not advocate for myself.
Yeah.
And my La Leche League friends created a calendar and they would literally make a meal like in one of those aluminum pans and put it on the chair on my porch 2 or 3 times a week.
Wow.
And they wouldn't even like need to come in. And so I knew when someone was going to be bringing dinner and they just did it. And it was amazing. And the first time through, my mom was not available to help me. But the second time through, my mother was living in my basement.
Whoa.
So I spent the first week after my home birth laying in bed. My mom changed my sheets and did my laundry. She's super not intrusive. And I nursed my baby and I laid there and I read a book.
Wow.
And I learned how to nurse side lying. And it was a freaking game changer. And I never set up the crib. I put the crib mattress on the floor. Yeah. And I put a twin mattress on the floor and I never set up the crib. And I would sideline nurse, and I would just roll away from her on the twin mattress and go to my bed. It was just an entirely different experience.
Yeah. How did you know that side lying existed? Did you just fall into it because you were like laying in the bed from the home birth? Or
I think so.
Yeah. You're like, oh my gosh,
this is amazing.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think she was 8.5 pounds and she was just a little bit more robust. It was easier to latch her side lying. I didn't have to finagle this little tiny 6.5 pound thing. Yeah. It was just, I had more help. She slept. And so when she had crappy nights, I knew that. And I knew I wasn't going back to my corporate job. I stayed home for a year with my baby. And I did not have postpartum psychosis. I did not have hallucinations. I hung out with my kids.
Yeah.
I had postpartum rage against the system. Yeah. I raged about the feeling of slavery and the feeling of being trapped and not being compensated for the work that I'm doing, bringing these people into the universe. I say that I raged for 3 years, but I probably am still raging.
You're still raging, right? Yeah.
And again, marriage counseling with my husband, but breastfeeding was so much different. I still had the shark bite sensation.
Yeah.
I just thought that was normal.
Yeah. And, it's so hard because there's a lot of conflicting voices where people tell you pain in the initial breastfeeding period is normal. And different people's threshold for pain varies. And there's a difference between pain and discomfort. And you had done it before. You felt breastfeeding not hurt.
Yes.
But it had hurt for the first 3 weeks, the first time around. And so did you just think, okay, this will just resolve?
Yes.
And when you felt the shark bite initially, did you ask your home birth midwife? I mean, were you getting more checkups than in the first time?
I don't want to throw my home birth midwife under the bus, but no. And I think I come across as a super competent person, right? Death by competence. I got this. I popped out a baby. I'm nursing. They gain, they pee, they poop. I think people are like, if you're good, you're good. And I don't know.
I've got my chart on the wall of the tasks people are going to do. Yeah.
My mother's here. You're good. I still had, massive postpartum anxiety and the incineration of the previous life and the postpartum rage. But I was, at that point, I was so immersed. Oh, so Julia, I stay home with my kiddos for a year and it's torture and bliss all at the same time.
Yeah.
Right?
I think anyone who has stayed home with their kids,
torture and bliss,
know that you have hit it on the nose. Yeah, it's so hard to describe how much you love it
and hate it.
And hate it. Yeah. And I have encountered people who truly just like love every second.
Cool.
And that's great.
I would pat my beautiful daughter on the back and mouth to my husband, I hate her. not even in like angry or I want to kill her, but like, I hate where I am right now. This blows. I either need to poop or eat. And I hate this right now. And I know that this is blissful and torture at the same time.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And it's another one of those things where like, just because it's hard doesn't mean I don't want to do it.
Right. Yeah. What I do is there's no impact on you.
But if somebody were like, I would like to go get my PhD in microbiology and it's going to be really hard and I'm going to have to lose a lot of sleep and, it might take me many years to do it. And I might have a lot of failure along the way and I might have to rewrite my dissertation a couple of times. Nobody would be like, well, then why are you even going to try?
Right.
Because that's validated. That is a valid way to spend your time. But when it comes to like birth and breastfeeding our babies, if it's hard, stop doing it. It's a hard thing in a society where the stuff we do as women is not as valued.
I know. Hence the rage.
But, the whole point of the Milk Making Minutes is to reduce breastfeeding anxiety. And I think a lot of your story, even though there's a lot of hardship in it, to hear the story in advance and to know, that would be a reason to tell somebody.
Yes.
Yes. Somebody's safe. That yes. I don't have to suffer through that.
Yes. Like, I wish I reached out more.
Yeah. My next question for you is going to be, if you, knowing what you know now, having been a birth worker for 22 years or something like that, if you had the 28-year-old you sitting in front of you, what would you say to her?
It's going to be harder than you think, and you need all the resources. And asking for help doesn't make you less than. You don't have to prove anything to anybody, but focus on what's important to you. And if you want to work, then you're going to come home and you're going to be with your baby. Awesome. Cool. But figure out how to get food in your mouth, get time to go to the bathroom by yourself, and get sleep. Like, I wish I had a plan for that. I didn't realize it was going to be that hard. So when I had the second, I had people bring me food. I had my mom do my laundry. I laid down and figured out how to sideline nurse. I took the year, which again, torture and bliss, but I took the year and I didn't hallucinate. And I could address all of her sensory because I was there and addressing it as I needed to. And I could still get my needs met. So Julia nursed until she was 3.5. By the time she was 1, I was starting to do births. And so I was attending births as a doula. Yep. And apprenticing at home births and was able to pump enough and leave her with my husband to attend births. And this amazing group of women, I had a list of 12 women who could take my children at a moment's notice.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, I did. I had a list of 12 and they were amazing. And so I would watch their kids on the days that I was available and they would watch my kids, and that was awesome. There was a couple of times that, my friend Joanne nursed Julia and her daughter at the same time.
Cool.
There were a couple of times that I nursed Lydia and Julia at the same time.
That's amazing. I've never nursed another person's child.
Yeah. I tandem nursed the two. I nursed Julia till she was 3.5. And in the last year, we would do more limiting, right? Like I'm going to nurse till I sing ABCs 2 times and always with the sensory, always with the touching my neck, touching my chin, touching the other nipple. Oh my gosh, right?
Oh, I hated that. I never allowed the other nipple. I couldn't stand it.
Sorry. Never down my shirt, but when I was nursing, a lot of touching the other nipple.
Yeah.
And then one day, like she's 2.5 and 2 3/4 and 3 and 3 3/4. And one day I just woke up and it felt like in the last 6 months of our nursing, every time I sat down, she nursed. It just felt like it was like it felt like every time I sat down, she was nursing.
Right. And then you don't ever want to sit down, right?
I didn't ever want to sit down. Oh. And I just woke up one morning and I was like, oh, lovey, we're all done. And I put Band-Aids on my nipples.
Mm-hmm.
And again, hold and rock and love, and I will lay with you, and you can touch my mole and touch my neck and touch my chin.
Mm-hmm.
And I wore a turtleneck. And I put this, and I just woke up. There was no plan other than it was just there was no trauma. There was no crying. There was no you can't do, there was just oh, honey, we're all done. And she was like, oh, I'm sad. And I was like, yeah. It's all done. And she's like, I'm sad, mommy. I'm like, yeah, I am too.
Yeah. But had you planned that, or you just woke up that day and that was the end for you?
Like we were talking about it coming. But we hadn't picked a date.
Right. Okay. That was just the date for you. You knew that day.
You know what I think it is? I think I perhaps that night got enough sleep that I had enough emotional fortitude to be able to be kind and articulate and compassionate with her.
Yeah.
I think sometimes it's easy to just keep nursing because it takes energy to end something that's so significant,
Oh, yeah, it really does. Yeah. Well, Joyce, this has just been awesome.
I'm glad.
Thank you so much for taking the time to dig into your memories of so long ago. I think my listeners will have so much to learn from this conversation.
I'm so honored, Lo. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, this has been amazing. Is there anywhere you want people to connect with you?
People can always call me at 508-728-6588. They can always email me at joycekimball3@gmail.com. I do have a website. It's www.birthservices.net. But, you can.
Cool. I'll put it in the show notes.
Okay.
All right. Awesome.
Thanks, love. Tell JoJo I said hi.
Okay.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Milk Making Minutes. I hope you gained as much wisdom from Joyce as I do every time I get to have a conversation with her. If you know someone who could really benefit from hearing this episode, please share it with them. If you are looking for a growing community of people who get what it's like to breastfeed and who want to talk about the difficulties we face, but also the joys, please join my growing community at the Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook.